Imagine commanding, the kind of cultural dominance we usually associate with Steven Spielberg or George Lucas, but doing it in the 1790s.
Right. It's almost impossible to picture.
It really is. You're pulling down these astronomical paychecks that make your contemporaries look like they are just working for pennies. You are essentially inventing an entirely new literary genre from scratch.
Oh, absolutely. And the absolute titans of your era are reading your work, stealing your techniques, and using them to build their own masterpieces.
Exactly. And then right at the absolute zenith of your power, you pull a vanishing act, you fade into obscurity, dropping out of the public consciousness, almost like a ghost in one of your own novels.
Which remains one of the most baffling disappearing acts in cultural history, honestly. I mean, we are talking about an author so universally revered that the fiercest critics of her day literally dubbed her the Shakespeare of romance writers.
Wow. The Shakespeare of romance writers. That is a massive title.
It is. And that wasn't just some title handed out as a marketing gimmick. It was a serious critical assessment of her structural impact on fiction.
So that's exactly what we are unpacking today in this deep dive. We're looking at the life, the mechanics, and the staggering legacy of Anne Radcliffe.
Yeah.
And our goal here isn't just to do a historical postmortem on an 18th century author. It's to figure out how this intensely private, aggressively reclusive woman fundamentally rewired the human experience of fear and suspense.
That's the real core of it. Yeah.
Right. So if you've ever felt your pulse spike watching a modern psychological thriller, or you felt that creeping dread in the pit of your stomach reading a mystery, you are experiencing a neurochemical reaction that Anne Radcliffe meticulously engineered.
She really built the architecture of modern suspense. And I think to understand how she did it, we have to start with the staggering paradox of her life.
The recluse superstar.
Exactly. On one side of the ledger, you have this unprecedented continent-spanning fame. On the other, an almost militant dedication to anonymity.
Let's establish the baseline first, though. She was born Anne Ward in London in 1764. And I think the critical piece of context here is her background, right? She was thoroughly middle class.
Mm-hmm.
She wasn't born into aristocratic wealth, nor was she navigating some elite bohemian literary salon in London. She had a very conventional, insulated upbringing.
Yeah, very conventional. And the turning point arrives in 1788 when she marries William Radcliffe. He was an Oxford graduate and a working journalist.
Okay.
And what makes their dynamic fascinating and honestly highly unusual for the period is that William actively encouraged her to write.
Wow, really?
Yeah, he recognized her capacity for narrative and pushed her to pursue it. We really have to view this through the lens of 18th century gender roles.
Right, because that was not the norm.
Not at all. A husband actively fostering his wife's demanding, highly public intellectual labor was the exception, not the rule. She leveraged that foundational support and just completely upended the economics of the publishing industry.
Okay, let's talk about those economics,
Yeah.
because the math here is where the story gets wild.
Oh, it really does.
Look at her 1794 masterpiece, The Mysteries of Udolpho. She demanded and received £500 for the copyright.
Which is staggering.
It is. Now, just for a sense of scale in the literary market of the time, let's look at Jane Austen. 2 decades later, Jane Austen accepted £110 for Pride and Prejudice.
It is a phenomenal disparity. I mean, to fully grasp that dominance, we have to look at how authors were paid back then.
Right, because it wasn't like today.
Exactly. Most writers were dealing with subscription models, or they were essentially being treated as low-wage gig workers by publishers.
Basically churning out pages to survive.
Yeah. So £500 in 1794 wasn't just a good advance, it was generational wealth. It was the 18th century equivalent of a massive studio tentpole salary.
Like blockbuster movie money.
Exactly. In an era where female financial independence was virtually non-existent, where women were legally and practically locked out of the traditional economy, Anne Radcliffe was out-earning her most famous male contemporaries by a factor of 5.
But wait, this is where I hit a wall with the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Usually that level of extreme wealth and cultural dominance demands a public presence, right?
You'd think so, yes.
You become a fixture in society.
Yeah.
Yet the sources say she was notoriously reclusive. She hated the press, hated public recognition, and rarely left her house. So how do you pull down blockbuster money and just hide?
It's the ultimate question.
Like, how did she avoid the press and the paparazzi equivalent of the 1790s?
Well, basically by entirely compartmentalizing her identity. There was Anne Radcliffe, the literary brand, the name stamped on the most highly anticipated volumes in Europe.
Wait,
And then there was Anne Radcliffe, the private citizen who simply refused to play the game of celebrity. She didn't grant interviews, she didn't attend high society galas to promote her work. She just let the work operate as a standalone entity.
which is deeply ironic considering the scope of her work. I mean, she's a homebody, sitting in a comfortable English parlor, yet her novels are sweeping epics set in these treacherous exotic locales.
Oh, yeah. Ruined castles in Italy, dark, impenetrable forests in France.
The craggy peaks of the Apennines. I mean, she rarely traveled, yet she defined the geographical aesthetic of terror.
And that armchair travel is precisely why her landscapes feel the way they do.
What do you mean?
Well, she wasn't writing travelogues based on rigorous geographical observation. She was constructing psychological landscapes.
Ah,
She didn't need to know the exact topographical layout of the Apennine Mountains. She needed to know how a towering, shadowed peak makes a human being feel.
that's a great distinction.
Yeah, her lack of physical travel meant her imagination was entirely unfettered by mundane reality. She built these worlds from within, which leads us directly to the mechanics of her writing.
Right, how did she actually construct these blockbusters from the quiet of her study? Let's look at the output because it was surprisingly concentrated, wasn't it?
Very much so. She published 5 novels in a remarkably tight window between 1789 and 1797.
Okay.
The Romance of the Forest hits in 1791, and that's really the ignition point. It brings her massive initial fame.
And then comes the big one.
Yes, Udolpho in 1794 is the crown jewel. It follows Emily St. Aubert, this orphaned heroine who gets dragged through cruelties, imprisonment, and deeply unsettling, seemingly supernatural events in a massive, decaying fortress.
This is the classic setup.
It is. And then she caps it off with The Italian in 1797, which gives us Schedoni, one of the most psychologically complex, terrifying villains in literary history.
The impact of these specific texts really cannot be overstated. And
Wow.
before we retroactively applied the term Gothic to this specific flavor of suspense fiction, it was simply known across Europe as the Radcliffe School.
Exactly. She didn't merely contribute to a genre. Her specific methodology became its absolute definition.
But what exactly was the methodology? Like, if I'm an aspiring writer in 1795 trying to rip off the Radcliffe School, what specific mechanics am I copying?
Well, you are copying her absolute masterstroke, the explained supernatural.
The explained supernatural.
Yes, this is the engine of her genius. In a Radcliffe novel, she will spend hundreds of pages meticulously building an atmosphere of sheer supernatural dread.
Building the tent.
Exactly. The characters and the reader are entirely convinced that they are experiencing the impossible. A ghost in the corridor, a cursed artifact, a disembodied voice. The tension is just agonizing.
Okay, I have to stop you there.
Sure.
Because when you say explain supernatural, it sounds like she builds all this up just to debunk it. Like a really high-end episode of Scooby-Doo where you pull the mask off the monster and it's just, the corrupt real estate developer.
Ha! That's exactly what it is.
But doesn't that kill the scare? I mean, if the reader knows the ghost is going to be fake, why are they terrified?
It's a brilliant question, and it really gets to the heart of why she was so successful. It doesn't kill the scare, it legitimizes it.
Legitimizes it. How?
Think about the intellectual climate of the late 18th century. This is the Enlightenment.
Oh, right, the age of reason.
Exactly. The educated reading public wants to see themselves as rational, modern people who have cast off the superstitious darkness of the Middle Ages.
I see.
If Radcliffe just wrote straight-up ghost stories with actual demons, the critics would have dismissed it as pulpy, uneducated trash.
Ah, okay, so she gives them the visceral, adrenaline-pumping thrill of the supernatural, but lets them keep their intellectual dignity.
Precisely. It's an epistemological restoration.
Wow, epistemological restoration. I love that phrase.
Right. She pushes the reader to the absolute brink of panic, letting them indulge in the terror of the unknown. But by ultimately providing a rational, natural explanation like the ghostly groan was just the wind through a specific architectural flaw, or the apparition was a smuggler using a hidden passage, she restores order.
Reason conquers superstition.
Yes. This move single-handedly made the Gothic genre respectable to the literary establishment.
It's essentially the birth of the psychological thriller.
Uh-huh.
Because if the demon isn't real, then the fear is generated entirely by the human mind.
Exactly. The horror comes from isolation, from paranoia, and from the very real physical cruelty of the human captors.
So you get the dopamine hit of the mystery being solved, all the impossible loose ends tying up perfectly, but the residual trauma of the suspense still lingers.
That's it. And achieving that sustained suspense requires a very specific understanding of how the human brain processes fear. Radcliffe didn't just stumble into this. She heavily theorized it.
Which is so fascinating.
She made a strict, defining distinction between two concepts that we often mistakenly use interchangeably today: terror and horror.
This is where her genius really crystallizes for me. She wasn't just writing scary stories. She was dissecting the anatomy of fear itself. How did she define the difference?
Well, for Radcliffe, terror and horror are diametrically opposed psychological states.
Okay.
Terror, she argued, is an emotion that expands the soul. It awakens the faculties. Terror relies on suspense, obscurity, dread, and uncertainty. It is the agonizing anticipation of what might be lurking in the shadows.
The fear of the unknown.
Exactly. It forces the reader's imagination to do the heavy lifting, projecting their own deepest anxieties into the unseen space.
And
Horror, she stated, freezes the soul.
freezes it.
Yes, it shuts the imagination down entirely. Horror utilizes revulsion, gore, shock, and the grotesque. It is the moment the monster steps into the light or the sight of the physical carnage.
Right, because there's nothing left to imagine.
Exactly. When you are confronted with absolute horror, there is no room left for the imagination to play. You are simply paralyzed by disgust or shock.
So, to use a cinematic analogy here, terror is the shadow moving under the locked door. You don't know who's on the other side. You don't know what they want. Your brain is frantic. Your pulse is hammering.
Yep, that's terror expanding the soul.
And then horror is when the door's kicked open and a guy with a bloody chainsaw is standing there. The suspense evaporates, and you're just left with the visceral shock of the threat.
That is exactly right.
So Radcliffe is the undisputed master of the shadow.
Absolutely, and we can see how she executes this on a prose level, too. Radcliffe heavily utilized what critics call romantic sensibility. She understood that to sustain terror, the environment itself had to become an active participant in the character's psychological breakdown.
How does that actually work in the text? Give me the mechanics of a Radcliffe landscape.
She weaponized the concept of the sublime.
The sublime, okay.
Yes, the idea that nature can be so vast, so powerful, and so indifferent that it inspires a sense of awe that borders on terror. When her heroine is approaching the villain's castle, Radcliffe doesn't just say it was a dark night.
Right, that'd be too simple.
She spends pages describing the jagged, hostile geography of the mountains, the oppressive weight of the storm clouds, the sheer, dizzying drop of the precipice. The external landscape becomes a mirror for the heroine's internal emotional state.
That's brilliant.
And then the architecture is decaying and labyrinthine, physically manifesting the psychological confusion and entrapment of the protagonist.
She's essentially trapping the reader in the character's sensory experience.
Yes, completely.
You know, Hitchcock built his entire career on this exact philosophy. He famously explained the difference between surprise and suspense. Surprise is a bomb going off under a table, out of nowhere.
Right.
But suspense is showing the audience the bomb and then letting them watch the characters have a normal conversation for 5 minutes. Radcliffe codified that rule in the 1790s.
He really did.
But this brings up a crucial point. If she is focusing so intensely on psychological dread and entrapment, we have to look at who is being trapped. Her protagonists fit a very specific mold.
They do. The quintessential Radcliffe protagonist is an innocent, heroic young woman, suddenly stripped of her support systems, who finds herself isolated and imprisoned by a cruel, tyrannical older man.
And on the surface, I mean, that sounds like a standard damsel in distress trope.
Sure.
But the stakes in these novels are highly specific. What are these women actually fighting against?
They are fighting for their property and their autonomy.
Wow.
And this is where the brilliance of Radcliffe's work takes on a deeply subversive, proto-feminist layer.
I love this part.
The villains, the Montonis and the Shidonis, aren't supernatural demons trying to steal their souls. They are patriarchal figures using physical intimidation and psychological torture to force these young women to sign over their inheritance, their land deeds, and their financial independence.
Let's not gloss over this because this isn't just a fun literary motif. It's a direct, blistering critique of 18th century legal reality.
Absolutely.
Under the legal doctrine of coverture, a woman's legal rights and her property were entirely subsumed by her husband upon marriage. Even unmarried women with inheritances were constantly at the mercy of male guardians or relatives.
Exactly. So when Radcliffe places her heroine in a remote, inescapable castle, at the mercy of a man who has total physical and legal control over her environment, she isn't inventing a fantasy scenario.
She's dramatizing reality.
Yes, she is taking the mundane, everyday legal reality of an 18th century marriage contract and turning the volume up to a 10. The Haunted Castle is simply a dramatized, Gothic exaggeration of the domestic drawing room.
But wait, her audience wasn't just radical reformers. She was the best-selling author in Europe. How did she slip such a sharp critique of male authority and property theft past the highly conservative, patriarchal gatekeepers of the era?
Well, by wrapping it in the velvet glove of the Gothic romance.
Oh,
Because the villain is framed as a tyrannical Italian aristocrat in the 1500s, an English reader in 1795 can tut-tut at the barbarism of the past, completely ignoring that the exact same power dynamic is playing out in their own legal system.
that is so smart. It's a brilliant subversive mechanism.
It really is. And Radcliffe's heroines are not passive victims. They actively resist. They refuse to sign the papers. They maintain their psychological fortitude in the face of immense terror.
It perfectly mirrors Radcliffe's own life, really.
Oh, absolutely.
She was a woman fiercely protecting her autonomy, controlling her massive wealth, and refusing to allow the public or the press to consume her identity. She essentially practiced what she preached through her heroines.
And that potent combination, the mastery of suspense, the psychological depth, the subversive social commentary, is why her work didn't just sell well. It permanently altered the DNA of Western literature. We have to look at the ripple effect.
Right.
Her innovations became the foundational language for the titans who followed her.
The A-list of her admirers is absolutely staggering. Let's look at Jane Austen. We already compared their respective payouts, but Austen's relationship with Radcliffe's work goes so much deeper than just industry peers. Austen was heavily influenced by her.
Yes, and the most famous example of this is Austen's Northanger Abbey. It is fundamentally a parody of the Radcliffe school.
Right, the protagonist is obsessed with Gothic novels.
Exactly. Catherine Morland has read so much Radcliffe that she starts hallucinating Gothic conspiracies in a perfectly normal English country house. She expects her host to be a murderous tyrant. She thinks old laundry bills in a cabinet are secret manuscripts.
But parody in this sense isn't a dismissal, is it? I mean, you can't parody something unless it is a universally shared cultural touchstone.
Exactly. Austen could only write Northanger Abbey because she knew every single one of her readers intimately understood Radcliffe's tropes. It's a loving homage that relies entirely on Radcliffe's cultural dominance.
Wow.
But the influence goes far beyond parody. Look at the foundational figures of the Romantic movement. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Lord Byron.
The heavy hitters of poetry. What are they taking from Radcliffe?
They are adopting her romantic sensibility, Radcliffe's concept of the sublime, her use of nature as a mirror for human passion and terror that provided a thematic vocabulary for the Romantics.
Oh, I see.
When Keats writes about cold, decaying castles and intense emotional states, or when Byron constructs the brooding, morally ambiguous Byronic hero, they are lifting directly from the blueprints Radcliffe drew with villains like Shidoni.
And it just keeps rolling forward. You move into the Victorian era and you see her fingerprints all over Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the Bronte sisters. I mean, you can't have the mad woman locked in the attic in Jane Eyre without Radcliffe inventing the architecture of domestic imprisonment first.
That's a great point.
Charles Dickens' atmospheric dread in Bleak House or Great Expectations owes a massive debt to her. And moving into the 20th century, Edgar Allan Poe's entire philosophy of psychological terror and Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, which is essentially a modernized psychological update of Udolpho.
Yeah, Radcliffe didn't just inspire these writers to write scary stories. She gave them the specific mechanical tools to do it. The pacing of suspense, the use of architecture as psychology, the concept of the explained supernatural. These became the default settings for the thriller genre.
Which brings us to the ultimate paradox, the question we asked at the very top.
Right.
If she is the architect of the modern thriller, if Austen and Poe and the Brontes all drank from her well, why is her name not spoken in the same breath as theirs today? Why did she fall from grace so sharply in the 20th century?
The erasure of Anne Radcliffe is a complex phenomenon, but it primarily stems from the intense shyness we discussed earlier.
Her refusal to play the fame game.
Exactly. In the 19th century, the literary culture shifted. We began to fetishize the persona of the author. We wanted the mad, bad, and dangerous to know mythology of a Lord Byron.
We wanted the tragic, tormented darkness of an Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes. We wanted the scandalous bohemian life of Mary Shelley.
Right, the author's life becomes part of the marketing for the book. The myth sustains the legacy.
Precisely. But Anne Radcliffe offered no mythology. She just wanted to live quietly with your husband. Because she refused to play the celebrity game, she became an invisible woman.
Wow.
And when you are invisible, it is remarkably easy for history to overwrite your contributions.
And let me guess, the people doing the overwriting were mostly male authors who took her techniques, turned up the gore shifting from her terror to the more visceral horror, and claimed the genre for themselves.
That is exactly what happened. Writers like Matthew Lewis, who wrote The Monk, leaned heavily into the explicit horror and shock value that Radcliffe despised.
Ah, The Monk, yes.
The genre morphed, the male authors grew louder, and literary historians gradually began to attribute the architectural foundations of the Gothic to the men who followed her, rather than the woman who invented it.
The cost of her privacy was her historical credit.
Sadly, yes.
It's incredibly frustrating. I mean, she builds the house, she furnishes it, and then history gives the deed to the guys who show up 50 years later and paint the walls black.
That's a very apt way of putting it.
But the narrative doesn't end there, thankfully. We're currently witnessing a massive critical resurrection.
Yes, we are. Modern scholarship is actively working to correct the record. There is a concerted effort to publish comprehensive, annotated editions of her complete works.
That's amazing.
Literary historians are pushing past the label of Gothic romance writer and reevaluating her as a profound psychological novelist, a pioneer of the feminist critique in fiction, and a master theoretician of suspense.
It feels like an incredibly hard-won poetic justice. After centuries of being a ghost in her own genre, obscured by the very shadows she taught us how to fear, Anne Radcliffe is finally being restored to the literary canon.
She changed the neurochemistry of reading forever. It is time we recognize the engineer.
Let's pull back and look at the sheer scale of what we've covered today. We started with a middle-class woman who leveraged her husband's support to shatter the economic ceiling of 18th century publishing.
Unprecedented stuff.
Totally. We examined how she bypassed the cheap scares of actual monsters, inventing the explained supernatural to legitimize the genre and give birth to the psychological thriller. We dissected her profound understanding of fear, the vital distinction between the expanding suspense of terror and the paralyzing shock of horror.
Shadow versus the chainsaw.
Exactly. We uncovered how her remote haunted castles were actually searing indictments of coverture laws and patriarchal property theft. And we traced a direct line from her quiet study to the masterpieces of Austen, the Romantics, Poe, and beyond.
It is an unparalleled legacy. And as we wrap up, I think there is one final lingering implication of her work that feels incredibly relevant right now.
Oh, yeah.
Think about the core promise of the explained supernatural. It was Radcliffe's way of domesticating fear.
Domesticating fear.
Yes, it was a contract with the reader. No matter how terrifying, chaotic, or impossibly dark the world seems, reason, logic, and human resilience will ultimately pull back the veil and explain the monster away.
Wow. That hits hard. Because look at the world today. We are saturated with complex, overwhelming, and seemingly unexplainable anxieties.
We live in an era of global dread.
Yeah. Are we still consuming thrillers, mysteries, and true crime, not just for the adrenaline, but because we are desperate for that Radcliffean reassurance?
I think so.
We just want someone to prove to us that the monsters in the dark can be understood and ultimately defeated.
It's a compelling thought. We may have traded the haunted castles for modern anxieties, but we are still chasing the exact psychological relief that she engineered 2 centuries ago.
We just want to know that the shadow under the door has a rational explanation.
Exactly.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the origins of the media you consume, look critically at the mechanics of the stories you love, and never forget the forgotten titans hiding in the shadows. We'll catch you on the next one.